In the freezing December of 1944, deep in the Ardennes forest, history was not only written in the clash of men and machines, but in the invisible flow of fuel. Tanks, trucks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, and aircraft all had one common weakness. They could not move without gasoline. And while Hitler's generals believed they could launch one last great offensive that would split the Allies, capture Antwerp, and force the Western powers to the negotiating table, their plan rested upon the most fragile of foundations: fuel. The German war machine had tanks and men, but it did not have oil. In contrast, the United States and its allies possessed fuel reserves so vast that American soldiers could leave jeeps idling for hours in the snow, burn gasoline for warmth, or race supply convoys nonstop along the Red Ball Express, while German elite units abandoned their most powerful weapons in the mud because their tanks had run dry. This contrast between plenty and desperation defined the Battle of the Bulge, and it became one of the clearest demonstrations in history that wars are not only won by courage or strategy, but by logistics, industrial output, and the unglamorous science of petroleum supply. When Adolf Hitler conceived his final gamble in the West, Operation Walk am Rhein, his commanders immediately knew that the entire operation hinged on fuel. The Wehrmacht could scrape together men, equipment, and even a surprise attack, but it could not manufacture oil out of nothing. By late 1944, Germany's synthetic fuel plants at Luna and Politz were being bombed into rubble by Allied aircraft. Romania's oil fields at Ploiești, once Germany's lifeline, had been lost to Soviet advances. What remained were dwindling reserves, stockpiled desperately in hidden depots, and the hope that seizing American fuel dumps would supply the momentum needed to drive armored spearheads all the way to the Meuse River and beyond. Waffen-SS General Joachim Peiper, leading the tip of the spear with Kampfgruppe Peiper, carried orders to capture Allied fuel wherever possible, for even his formidable Tiger II tanks guzzled fuel at a rate that made every mile precious. And yet, the cruel irony of the campaign would be that German tank crews often found themselves within sight of American fuel depots holding millions of gallons, but unable to reach them because of fierce resistance and rapid Allied counterattacks. The Americans, by contrast, were fighting with an energy base that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. In 1944 alone, the United States produced nearly 180 million tons of oil, more than 30 times Germany's entire output of 5.7 million tons. Operation PLUTO, the Pipelines Under the Ocean project, was already pumping 1 million gallons of fuel per day directly across the English Channel, a feat of engineering that ensured supply for Patton's tanks and Allied air forces. The Red Ball Express, a fleet of more than 6,000 trucks operated largely by African-American drivers, hauled 12,500 tons of fuel, ammunition, and food every single day across the continent, an unbroken artery of logistics that kept armies mobile in a way Germany could not match. For American soldiers, fuel seemed limitless. For German Panzer crews, every drop was life or death. This imbalance would prove decisive. At Spa and Stavelot, 2 American fuel depots held a staggering 3.3 million gallons of gasoline. When Peiper's forces swept toward them in December, the outcome of the offensive hung in the balance. If the Germans could capture and exploit these depots, they might prolong their advance, cross the Meuse, and threaten Antwerp. But they never succeeded. American engineers set some fuel stores ablaze, denying the enemy access. Others were protected by hastily assembled infantry and armored units who fought desperately to hold the depots at all costs. German troops could see the black smoke rising, could smell the gasoline, but they could not seize it in the quantities required. Instead, Peiper's mighty armored column ground to a halt. Tigers and Panthers were abandoned not because of Allied fire, but because their tanks were bone dry. The road to the Meuse was not blocked by men, but by mathematics. The simple fact that Germany did not have the gallons to get there. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. A Tiger II required nearly 700 liters of fuel for 100 kilometers. A Panther consumed about 700 liters per 150 kilometers. Each German armored division needed thousands of gallons per day just to remain operational. And yet, during the Ardennes offensive, the Germans often had only a fraction of that supply. In many cases, captured American jerrycans became as valuable as captured weapons. Panzer grenadiers would drain the tanks of disabled Allied vehicles, siphoning every last drop, while commanders drew up plans not around tactical opportunity, but around available fuel. The Panzers could fight brilliantly, but they could not fight for long. Meanwhile, the Americans fought with almost reckless abundance. Tanks advanced freely. Artillery units fired barges measured not in shells but in minutes, and trucks thundered across icy roads in endless convoys. The difference was so stark that German prisoners often remarked in disbelief at how casually Americans treated fuel, sometimes leaving engines running or even using gasoline as fire starters in the bitter cold. For soldiers raised on scarcity, this was not just military strength, it was a psychological weapon. The sight of endless Allied convoys was as demoralizing as any bombing raid. German soldiers knew that behind every American rifleman stood a pipeline, a refinery, and an entire industrial base that dwarfed anything Germany could hope to muster. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge, the German gamble had collapsed, not only because of Allied resistance and weather clearing for air power, but because the tanks that might have carried the Wehrmacht forward sat silent in the snow, their engines empty, their crews abandoning them to trudge back on foot. The Allies had lost men, machines, and ground in the opening days, but they had never lost fuel. That alone guaranteed eventual victory. The Ardennes proved the old saying that amateurs talk strategy, but professionals talk logistics. Hitler had bet on strategy. Eisenhower and Patton had logistics. The outcome was inevitable. As the German columns pushed deeper into the Ardennes, the question of fuel haunted every movement. Officers in Kampfgruppe Peiper's headquarters knew that the timetable for success was already slipping. Snowbound roads, blown bridges, and determined pockets of American resistance slowed their progress. Every hour lost meant more fuel consumed, more jerrycans emptied, and fewer miles gained before the tanks became useless steel carcasses. Peiper's orders were clear: seize American fuel wherever it could be found. But this order revealed Germany's desperation, for no military plan could endure when its very lifeblood depended on capturing the enemy's supplies. Warfare is built on certainty, yet here was an offensive designed around hope and chance. The Wehrmacht was gambling with every drop. When German armored spearheads rolled through small Belgian towns, they often sent detachments racing into side streets searching for hidden fuel stores. Civilians recalled Panzer crews frantically banging on barrels, opening sheds, and even dipping sticks into water troughs in the hope of finding something combustible. American depots, however, were guarded and prepared. Engineers and quartermasters received instructions to destroy fuel rather than allow it to fall into German hands. Fires roared into the winter sky, black smoke visible for miles, a grim beacon of both abundance and denial. Germans could see their salvation burning before their eyes, yet they could do nothing. Peiper himself, after reaching Stavelot, found American fuel but not in the quantities necessary to sustain a full armored division. The result was cruel. The Panzers had advanced farther than their reserves could sustain. Momentum died not at the muzzle of an American gun, but in the fuel tanks of their own vehicles. The Americans, meanwhile, never worried about fuel beyond the usual logistical coordination. The Red Ball Express and its successors had made supply almost a reflex. In the fall of 1944, when Patton's Third Army threatened to outrun its supply lines, the response was not panic but organization. Thousands of trucks poured across France, forming an unbroken supply chain. Each gallon delivered was multiplied into movement, firepower, and endurance. The scale defied imagination. By December, American depots on the continent contained reserves measured not in barrels, but in millions of gallons. Fuel flowed across the channel through PLUTO pipelines, through ports at Cherbourg and Antwerp, and in convoys stretching to the horizon. To an American soldier in the Ardennes, fuel was simply there. To a German soldier, it was always vanishing. In fact, one of the most striking contrasts of the campaign came from prisoner interrogations. Captured German tankers admitted they were instructed to conserve fuel at all costs, sometimes shutting off engines on downhill slopes or abandoning supply vehicles to keep tanks operational. American interrogators were astonished. For them, conserving fuel meant little more than paperwork. This cultural difference reflected deeper truths about the war. America fought with industrial abundance, Germany with diminishing improvisation. Soldiers at the front lines sensed it keenly. By the third week of December, Peiper's spearhead stalled entirely. His column, once spearheaded by powerful Tiger IIs, was now a haggard procession of exhausted men and immobilized vehicles. Tanks were blown up by their own crews to prevent capture, left smoldering in ditches or frozen on roadways. In some cases, the engines were perfectly functional, the armor undamaged, but the tanks would never move again because their tanks were dry. These images became some of the most iconic symbols of the Battle of the Bulge. Massive machines, monuments to German engineering, rendered impotent by a simple shortage of gasoline. War had revealed its most merciless law, that without fuel, the mightiest weapons were worthless. The Allies exploited this weakness mercilessly. American artillery fired barges with little concern for conserving shells, because they knew trucks and depots could resupply them endlessly. Allied aircraft, once the weather cleared, struck at German columns not only to destroy vehicles, but to sever what little supply trickled behind them. Every convoy destroyed, every road clogged with wreckage, deepened the German fuel crisis. Hitler had gambled on speed and surprise, but both required gasoline. With each day of delay, his gamble slipped further into impossibility. General Eisenhower and his staff understood this perfectly. While frontline commanders worried about the tactical situation, the fall of Bastogne, the pressure at St. Vith, the bulge in the lines, Ike and his logisticians measured German weakness in gallons. They knew that even if the Panzers broke through, they could not stay mobile without capturing massive Allied reserves. Eisenhower once remarked that Hitler's offensive was doomed the moment it depended on seizing fuel, for the Americans had already prepared to deny it at any cost. He was right. For the German soldier in the Ardennes, the fuel shortage became a daily humiliation. Stories circulated of elite panzer crews reduced to marching on foot, of heavy tanks abandoned in farm fields, of officers bargaining for captured American jerrycans as though they were bars of gold. Some German units attempted to disguise themselves in American uniforms to infiltrate depots, but such acts could not change the arithmetic of supply. The Wehrmacht was attempting to fight a mechanized war without the mechanism that powered it. Every mile deeper into Belgium was another mile farther from the dwindling stocks in Germany. The retreat, when it came, was as much about empty fuel tanks as enemy firepower. By January 1945, the offensive had collapsed. German divisions withdrew in disorder, leaving behind burned-out tanks, horse-drawn wagons, and exhausted men. The fuel problem had not only limited the attack, but doomed it from the outset. The Americans reclaimed lost ground swiftly, their vehicles roaring forward without pause, while German commanders admitted privately that fuel had been the real enemy all along. The Battle of the Bulge had proven, beyond doubt, that modern war was not merely a contest of armies, but a contest of oil fields, refineries, and supply convoys. The story of fuel in the Ardennes cannot be told without stepping back to see the larger picture of oil in World War II. From the beginning, the entire German war effort was constrained by petroleum. Unlike the United States, which sat atop vast reserves in Texas, Oklahoma, and California, and could call upon allies in the Middle East and Latin America, Germany had almost no natural oil. Its economy and its armies were chained to synthetic fuel production and whatever shipments it could squeeze from occupied territories. The drive into the Soviet Union in 1941 had not only been a quest for Lebensraum, but a desperate grab for the oil fields of the Caucasus. Hitler had raged at his generals when the Wehrmacht failed to capture Baku, declaring that without Caucasian oil, the war could not be won. By 1944, his words proved prophetic. Allied bombers had reduced synthetic fuel plants to rubble, oil imports had collapsed, and every offensive had to be weighed against the dwindling reserves left in the Reich stockpiles. The United States, in contrast, drowned in oil. Texas derricks pumped day and night, pipelines carried crude to refineries, and tankers carried gasoline across oceans. American production supplied not only its own armies but those of Britain, the Soviet Union, and Free France. A single American refinery could produce more gasoline in a month than Germany could hope to produce in the same period across all its remaining facilities. This abundance meant that while German commanders measured operations in kilometers per gallon, American generals measured them in ambition. Patton himself famously declared that his army would fight fuel, fight terrain, fight weather, but never run dry as long as the Red Ball Express rolled. That confidence proved true, and it gave the Allies freedom of maneuver the Germans could only envy. When German troops launched the Ardennes offensive, they carried perhaps 3 days of fuel reserves for their spearhead units. The hope was that swift victory and captured Allied depots would extend this window. But the Americans had learned from past battles. Depots were dispersed, guarded, and, when threatened, destroyed by their own defenders. The famous Spa Stavelot depots, with 3.3 million gallons of gasoline, could have turned the tide had Peiper seized them intact. Instead, German troops reached them only to find flames consuming their contents, the air thick with smoke as precious fuel was denied. What little they captured was a drop in the ocean compared to their needs. The Tigers and Panthers that rolled proudly into Belgium soon became static bunkers, their engines silenced by empty tanks. The Germans had hoped to use fuel as a weapon, to shock the Allies into panic and immobility by seizing their lifeblood. Instead, it was the Germans who suffered paralysis. The Ardennes became a graveyard of armored giants, magnificent tanks abandoned by the roadside not because they had been destroyed in combat, but because they had run out of gas. American soldiers were astonished when they inspected them. Perfectly functional, undamaged Tigers, machines that had terrified Allied crews for years, sat useless, their only flaw being an empty fuel tank. It was a vivid demonstration that in modern mechanized war, the true power lay not in steel and fire, but in liquid energy. For the Americans, the contrast was dramatic. They fought a war of movement, shifting divisions rapidly from north to south, reinforcing weak points, launching counterattacks, and surrounding Bastogne with relentless mobility. The trucks of the Red Ball Express roared through snow and ice, chains clanking, headlights piercing the fog, engines burning fuel that seemed limitless. To the German soldier, watching column after column of Allied supply trucks must have been a vision of despair. Each truck carried enough gasoline to power a German company, yet here the Americans used it casually, burning through reserves without hesitation. The imbalance was more than material, it was psychological. It showed that the Allies were not merely stronger on the battlefield, they were inexhaustible. General Eisenhower later admitted that fuel had been the one factor he feared might limit Allied progress in Europe. But even with supply challenges, the Allies always found ways to deliver. Pipelines crossed rivers, tankers docked at liberated ports, and trucks braved enemy fire to keep the front line supplied. The Germans had no such redundancy. A single destroyed bridge could cut off their fuel lifeline. A single strafing run from Allied fighter bombers could annihilate a column of fuel trucks. The skies above the Ardennes, once the weather cleared, became death zones for German supply. Every gallon was contested, every convoy a gamble. By contrast, American convoys rolled with such frequency and such confidence that fuel seemed as natural as air. By the campaign's end, the German retreat revealed the full scale of the disaster. Dozens of tanks were abandoned intact, not from enemy fire, but from starvation of fuel. German commanders could only watch as their prized armored divisions bled away into irrelevance, their spearheads collapsing into foot columns trudging back eastward. The mighty offensive that Hitler had promised would change the course of the war had instead become a demonstration of logistics triumphing over daring. The Germans had planned brilliantly on maps, but they had failed to supply their vision with the only thing that could make it real: gasoline. The story of fuel in the Ardennes is also the story of men, tankers, truck drivers, mechanics, and quartermasters, whose daily struggle determined victory more than any single general's order. American soldiers often joke that their real heroes were not the men firing rifles, but the men driving trucks. The Red Ball Express, though it had already completed its primary mission by the winter of 1944, remained a symbol of what logistics could achieve. Crews drove day and night, in snow, fog, and enemy fire, their trucks often overloaded and chained together in convoys that stretched for miles. Many of these drivers were African-American soldiers, relegated to service roles by segregationist policies, yet performing a task that kept entire armies alive. They did not earn headlines at the time, but their labor was the quiet pulse of Allied power. Every gallon of gasoline that kept Patton moving, every shell fired in Bastogne, every hot meal in the Ardennes was made possible because someone had driven it from a distant port or depot. German soldiers, by contrast, endured the opposite reality. For them, every day was a negotiation with scarcity. Tank commanders worried less about enemy ambushes than about how far they could travel before their last leaders were gone. Fuel convoys that tried to reach the front moved under constant threat of Allied aircraft. Once the weather cleared on December 23, 1944, the Luftwaffe could do almost nothing to protect them. Fighter bombers prowled the skies, strafing and bombing every truck they could spot. Fuel columns burned on the roadsides, great black plumes rising as the German offensive withered. Men who had been promised a swift march to the Meuse found themselves guarding empty tanks, waiting for supplies that never came. Some officers recorded in their diaries the bitter irony of commanding the most advanced armor in the world, but being unable to move it a mile without begging for captured American fuel. At Bastogne, the contrast reached its dramatic peak. The town, encircled by German forces, became the focus of both sides. For the Americans inside, fuel was scarce but never absent, arriving in small drops by air and protected by fierce defensive lines. For the Germans outside, fuel was a dream slipping further away with each passing hour. Tanks encircled the town, engines cold, waiting for supplies that could not arrive. When Patton's Third Army broke through from the south, it was not only courage that saved Bastogne but the ability to move quickly, to fuel tanks and trucks, and push them across frozen terrain without pause. The Germans, even with superior numbers in some sectors, simply could not maneuver fast enough to respond. The broader truth of the Ardennes was that America's oil fields were fighting alongside its soldiers. Each barrel pumped in Texas, each refinery working in Pennsylvania or New Jersey, was as decisive as any division on the battlefield. In 1944, American petroleum production reached staggering levels, accounting for two-thirds of the world's supply. Germany, cut off from imports and losing synthetic plants daily, could not compete. No amount of bravery or tactical ingenuity could reverse the imbalance. For every German tank stalled in the Ardennes, there were dozens of American Shermans and half-tracks rolling forward, their tanks filled to the brim. Even German generals admitted it privately. After the war, many reflected that the offensive had been doomed before it began. They could achieve surprise, they could shatter American lines temporarily, but they could not overcome the tyranny of logistics. Some calculated that even if Antwerp had been captured, their armies would have run dry long before securing the port. The offensive had been a mirage, a gamble built on the faint hope of capturing Allied fuel depots intact. But the Americans had understood this, and they had ensured that no depot of strategic value would fall whole into German hands. Fuel denied was as effective as fuel burned in combat. For the ordinary German soldier trudging through the snow, the shortage translated into misery. Rations dwindled, horses replaced trucks, and men froze in foxholes while their tanks sat idle nearby. For the ordinary American soldier, it meant warmth, food, mobility, and the confidence that supplies would keep coming. They fought knowing their country's industrial might stood behind them. That confidence was perhaps the greatest advantage of all. To fight with certainty, to know that reinforcements and fuel and food would arrive, was a psychological weapon as much as a material one. To fight with doubt, to watch vehicles abandoned and comrades scavenging for gasoline, was to live in the shadow of defeat even before the battle was decided. The Ardennes thus became more than a clash of armies. It was a test of national economies. It proved that modern war was not won merely by daring offensives, but by the invisible, relentless power of logistics. The Americans had mastered it, the Germans had lost it, and the result was inevitable. The silence of German tanks in the Ardennes left a haunting image in the minds of those who fought there. Soldiers recalled fields littered with armored vehicles that had not been destroyed in combat, but simply abandoned. Tigers and Panthers, mechanical monsters that had once terrified Allied crews, sat frozen and still, their tracks embedded in snow, engines lifeless. American troops advancing later would climb on them, marveling at the craftsmanship, but noting the fuel caps pried open, the tanks left behind not by choice but by necessity. For all their armor and firepower, they were nothing more than immovable hulks when gasoline was absent. It was as though the German war machine itself had starved to death in the Ardennes, its body still powerful, but its lifeblood drained away. Meanwhile, the Americans demonstrated a kind of casual extravagance with fuel that underscored their advantage. Soldiers warmed themselves beside gasoline-powered stoves, trucks idled for hours in the cold, and armored columns moved with confidence that supplies would not fail them. At Spa and Stavelot, depots contained millions of gallons, oceans of energy guarded with ferocity. Stories spread among German troops of these depots, tantalizingly close yet impossibly far, and officers urged their men forward with promises of fuel that never materialized. When Kampfgruppe Peiper's spearhead came within sight of such reserves, it seemed for a moment that the German gamble might pay off. But the Americans fought savagely to protect them, and Peiper's tanks, instead of refueling, found themselves trapped and encircled. Forced to abandon their vehicles, Peiper and his men trudged back through the snow on foot, their vaunted Panzers left behind, mute symbols of failure. Operation PLUTO, the pipeline under the ocean, represented another dimension of this unseen war. From England to France, millions of gallons coursed each day beneath the waves, an engineering marvel that ensured the Allied armies never lacked fuel after the Normandy landings. It was not only trucks and trains that kept the Americans moving, but also pipes, pumps, and planners who thought months ahead. In contrast, the Germans relied on dwindling reserves, vulnerable convoys, and a desperate hope that their enemies would make mistakes. The balance was not even close. America had built a logistical machine so vast that even the largest offensive the Germans could mount barely dented it. The mathematics of oil told the story with brutal clarity. In 1944, the United States produced 180 million tons of petroleum. Germany managed barely 5.7 million. It was like a contest between a giant and a starving man. No matter how skilled the starving man might be, no matter how cunning his tactics, he could not match the brute strength of his opponent. And oil, more than tanks or planes or guns, was the decisive strength. Each American truck, each Sherman, each bomber represented not only industrial might, but also the assurance of fuel. Each German tank, no matter how advanced, represented a question mark. How far can it go before it stops forever? The Battle of the Bulge made this question painfully clear. German commanders had promised Hitler a swift advance to the Meuse, a breakthrough that would split the Allies and perhaps even force a negotiated peace. But maps and arrows on a general's table did not show the empty fuel cans, the stalled convoys, the abandoned half-tracks. Reality caught up with ambition, and ambition collapsed. The German people paid the price. Their soldiers sacrificed in a hopeless gamble. The Americans, by contrast, demonstrated that war in the modern age belonged to those who could sustain it, who could feed and fuel their armies over vast distances without pause. The Ardennes was not only the last German offensive in the West, it was the final proof that the Axis had lost the war of supply. And so, while the snow-covered forests echoed with gunfire, artillery, and desperate struggle, beneath it all ran the quiet truth. Victory was flowing from fuel depots, pipelines, and refineries thousands of miles away. America had turned oil into a weapon more devastating than any single bomb or bullet, and in the winter of 1944, that weapon crushed Germany's last hope. In towns and villages across the Ardennes, the consequences of fuel starvation became impossible to ignore. German supply officers grew frantic, scouring barns and garages for anything that could be converted into fuel. Civilians watched as soldiers drained tractors, trucks, and even motorcycles, pouring the precious liquid into jerrycans meant for tanks that still would not start. Others tried to thin out what gasoline they had with alcohol or synthetic mixtures, but engines sputtered and died. Tanks that managed to move often left behind clouds of black smoke, their engines protesting against the poor quality fuel. For the men inside those steel monsters, every mile was a gamble, every engagement a countdown to silence. It was not enemy shells that terrified them most, but the inevitability of running dry. American soldiers, meanwhile, understood their enemy's weakness. Intelligence officers had intercepted reports about German shortages, and commanders adapted quickly. Instead of destroying fuel depots when retreats threatened, they fortified them, knowing the Germans could not win without seizing them. At Stavelot, one of the largest fuel sites, American defenders fought with desperation, not simply to hold ground, but to deny the Germans the very thing they needed most. It was a battle not just of bullets, but of barrels. Each gallon protected meant another day of mobility for the Allies, another day of paralysis for the enemy. Even the Red Ball Express, the relentless convoy system that had kept Allied armies supplied since Normandy, became part of this invisible contest. Thousands of trucks thundered down roads day and night, hauling gasoline in 5-gallon cans, feeding an army that consumed fuel like a living organism. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, risked their lives to keep the flow uninterrupted. They were rarely remembered in the headlines, but without them, the tanks at the front would have sat idle. Their courage ensured that Patton's divisions could pivot north and relieve Bastogne, a movement that would have been impossible without fuel. Thus, the unsung truckers of the Red Ball Express became silent heroes of the Bulge. The disparity in production was staggering. America had oil fields stretching across Texas, Oklahoma, and California, with refineries running at full capacity. Tankers carried crude to the East Coast, where it was refined, loaded into drums, and shipped to Europe in an endless cycle. The Germans, by contrast, relied heavily on synthetic fuel plants, many of which had been bombed into ruin by Allied air raids. Even when they produced, the output was pitiful compared to demand. By December 1944, Germany was living on fumes. The Ardennes offensive was not simply a last gamble. It was a gamble played on borrowed time and borrowed fuel, and the debts could not be paid. For German soldiers at the front, these realities were more immediate than strategic. They felt them in the cold as they waited beside silent tanks, in the fear as they realized artillery support would not come, in the bitterness as they abandoned vehicles they had trained to master. Their commanders urged them to fight on, to seize the depots, to believe in victory. But the truth was undeniable. Without gasoline, the Wehrmacht's might was only an illusion. American soldiers joked that they had found the best anti-tank weapon of the war, an empty fuel tank. The Ardennes thus became a graveyard of German armor, not destroyed by firepower, but by arithmetic. Columns stretched along snowy roads, cut off, immobilized, and easy targets for Allied planes once the weather cleared. What tanks remained burned precious fuel in retreat, each gallon carrying them not toward victory, but toward surrender. The fuel that might have propelled them to the Meuse or Antwerp instead carried them only far enough to collapse. It was the ultimate irony. Hitler's grand offensive, planned with secrecy and ambition, strangled itself before it could achieve its goals. In Bastogne, where American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne held out under siege, fuel was just as critical as ammunition and food. The defenders rationed what little they had, keeping jeeps and supply vehicles running only for essential tasks. Yet the balance was in their favor, for they knew that German tanks circling them were consuming the last drops of their reserves. When Patton's Third Army fought its way north, it was not only his bold maneuvering that saved Bastogne, but the steady stream of fuel that kept his armored columns rolling. Each Sherman tank that arrived carried with it the promise of liberation, fueled by the logistical miracle of Operation PLUTO and the Red Ball Express. The contrast could not have been greater. On one side, German officers argued bitterly over whether to attempt another push toward the Meuse or conserve the last barrels of gasoline for retreat. On the other, American commanders allocated fuel for offensives, confident that their depots and supply lines would replenish whatever they spent. The difference was not just material, it was psychological. The Germans fought knowing every shell fired, every mile traveled, brought them closer to exhaustion. The Americans fought knowing that reinforcements and supplies were already on their way, carried by convoys that never seemed to stop. Stories circulated among American troops about abandoned German tanks found with their crews gone, engines cold, and not a scratch from combat. Some soldiers joked about taking souvenirs from these mechanical giants, once feared on the battlefield, now rendered useless by something as simple as an empty tank. Others marveled at the desperation, finding entire German squads guarding fuel trucks, as though they were more valuable than artillery. In many ways, they were. A single truck of gasoline could mean the difference between retreat and survival for an entire column. The Germans themselves understood this grim irony. Prisoners captured during the Bulge often spoke of their frustration, not with American strength, but with their own shortages. Many described the offensive as doomed from the start, a bold plan shackled by reality. Hitler's insistence on seizing Antwerp to split the Allied armies had never accounted for the fact that his forces could not physically get there. The fuel simply did not exist. Officers warned him, logistics experts calculated the shortfall, but the orders came anyway. And so, thousands marched and fought in a campaign already crippled before the first shot was fired. Meanwhile, the Americans turned fuel into a weapon of strategy. They guarded depots with fanatical determination, knowing their destruction or capture could alter the course of battle. At Stavelot, Spa, and other key sites, bloody clashes erupted over storage tanks and pipelines. In some cases, retreating Allied units set fuel ablaze to deny it to the enemy, creating infernos that lit up the snowy skies. But more often than not, the Germans arrived too late, their vehicles sputtering to a stop within sight of the very fuel that might have carried them to victory. By mid-January 1945, the offensive had burned itself out. The German tide that had surged forward now ebbed back, leaving behind wreckage on the frozen roads of Belgium and Luxembourg. Thousands of vehicles, some of the most advanced tanks of the war, lay scattered and abandoned, silent monuments to a logistical defeat. What Hitler had imagined as a stunning reversal of fortune had become, in truth, the last gasp of an army that no longer had the fuel to fight. The lesson of the Bulge was unmistakable. Modern war was no longer won by courage or surprise alone. It was won by supply chains, by refineries, by the invisible lifelines of oil and fuel that kept armies in motion. America's 3.3 million gallons at just 2 depots told the story better than any battlefield could. They represented an industrial power so vast, so relentless, that even the most daring German assault could not overcome it. The collapse of the German offensive was not just a battlefield event. It was the visible breaking point of an empire that had stretched beyond its means. Hitler's gamble in the Ardennes was his last attempt to turn back the tide, yet it was built on a foundation of empty barrels and desperate hope. When the tanks stopped moving, when the infantry could no longer be supported by armored thrusts, the illusion of momentum shattered. German soldiers trudged back through snow and mud, exhausted, cold, and demoralized, knowing they had been asked to achieve the impossible. For the Americans, victory in the Bulge reinforced a truth that had been growing clearer with each passing month of the war. Their strength did not rest solely in the bravery of soldiers or the ingenuity of commanders, but in the colossal weight of their industry. The United States was producing oil at a rate Germany could scarcely imagine, 180 million tons annually compared to Germany's meager 5.7 million. No matter how skilled the Panzer divisions, no matter how fearsome their Tigers and Panthers, the mathematics of war had become merciless. A tank without fuel was not a weapon, it was a coffin. In hindsight, the Ardennes offensive serves as one of history's clearest demonstrations of logistics as destiny. When German commanders pored over their maps, tracing arrows toward Antwerp, they were not truly planning a military maneuver, but indulging in fantasy. The fuel needed to carry those arrows to completion simply did not exist. American planners, on the other hand, accounted for every gallon. Operation PLUTO pumped 1 million gallons daily beneath the English Channel, while the Red Ball Express delivered 12,500 tons of supplies every day on the continent. The Americans didn't just win battles, they guaranteed them before the fighting even began. At Spa and Stavelot, where millions of gallons of gasoline were stored, American guards could look out across the snowy forests and know that their depots were worth more than forts or trenches. German units drew close, at times nearly within reach, but the irony was cruel. Their tanks sputtered out within sight of salvation. Men cursed and abandoned vehicles that had once been the pride of Hitler's armies. Some tried to siphon drops from wrecks. Others loaded horses to drag equipment back east. It was a medieval sight in a modern war, the Wehrmacht reduced to improvisation while their enemies swam in fuel. American soldiers could not help but notice the contrast. They lit cigarettes, warmed food, and kept engines running through the cold, never doubting that another convoy would arrive tomorrow with more of the same. For them, gasoline was so plentiful that it was used not only for tanks and trucks, but also to power generators, to heat tents, to run everything from kitchens to hospitals. It was life itself, and they had it in abundance. To the Germans, this excess was unfathomable. To the Americans, it was normal. That difference in perception mirrored the larger truth of the war. One side still imagined scarcity as fate, the other saw surplus as a weapon. By late January, the bulge in the Allied lines had been flattened, the front restored, and the Germans thrown back with losses they could never replace. The offensive had cost Germany nearly 100,000 casualties, thousands of vehicles, and the last reserves of fuel that might have been used to defend their own borders. The Americans and their allies, though bloodied, had proven that their strength was inexhaustible. The tide of war had not merely shifted, it had become unstoppable. The battle for fuel in the Ardennes was more than a tactical episode. It was the revelation of a new age of warfare. No longer would generals think only in terms of maneuvers and offensives. They would think in terms of tonnage, pipelines, convoys, and reserves. Fuel was not just a commodity. It was strategy, power, and victory itself. And in December 1944, the Germans learned that lesson too late. The winter forests of the Ardennes became littered with the silent hulks of Germany's once proud armored divisions. The mighty Tigers, which had once struck terror into Allied tank crews, stood abandoned along frozen roads, their long barrels pointing aimlessly toward the sky. Panthers and half-tracks were left behind in ditches, engines dead, crews vanished into the woods. To the Americans, each wreck was a testament to the futility of German ambition. To the Germans, they were gravestones marking the end of their offensive dreams. Fuel shortages had transformed what Hitler envisioned as a lightning strike into a stumbling retreat. The initial shock of the German assault had been real. Towns like Malmedy, St. Vith, and Hatton had felt the full fury of the attack, but momentum drained as quickly as gasoline. Infantry marched hungry and freezing, armored spearheads dwindled to a crawl, and entire battalions became immobile in the snow. The Wehrmacht had gambled everything on speed, but speed required fuel, and that was the one thing they could not conjure. Meanwhile, American forces regained their confidence. Soldiers who had been caught off guard by the sudden German thrust now found strength in their steady supply lines. Reinforcements poured in, carried by convoys that moved day and night, their headlights dimmed but their engines roaring. Artillery batteries fired without fear of running out of shells, for ammunition wagons followed closely behind. Tanks refueled and returned to battle, knowing that gasoline was always waiting just a few miles to the rear. The machine of war, fueled by an industrial base unmatched in history, simply could not be stopped. Captured German soldiers often spoke bitterly of their frustration. Many admitted that they had fought with determination at the start, believing they might split the Allies and force a negotiated peace. But as their tanks sputtered out and supply wagons failed to arrive, they knew the truth. They had been sent on a mission impossible from the very beginning. Some cursed Hitler for ignoring the warnings of his generals, who had calculated that the offensive could not be sustained. Others simply stared in disbelief when shown the vast fuel depots the Americans had guarded so effectively. Millions of gallons sat behind barbed wire, more than enough to carry the German army to Antwerp and beyond, if only they could have reached it. Yet they never did. The depots at Spa and Stavelot remained in American hands, guarded fiercely because commanders understood that those tanks of fuel were as important as any fortified position. When Kampfgruppe Peiper, one of the most feared SS units, pushed close, its advance slowed not by American tanks, but by the empty tanks of its own vehicles. Peiper's men fought with ferocity, but when their engines went silent, their strength collapsed. Surrounded and cut off, they were forced to abandon their vehicles and retreat on foot, leaving behind a trail of burned-out armor that stretched for miles. The symbolism was powerful. Here was the elite of Hitler's army, defeated not by lack of courage, not by inferior weapons, but by the cold, hard arithmetic of logistics. For every gallon of fuel the Germans burned, the Americans had 10 waiting. For every convoy the Germans attempted, the Allies ran 100. The contrast was insurmountable, and the outcome inevitable. By the time the Ardennes offensive ended, It was clear to all who fought there that the war had entered its final stage. Germany had spent its last reserves in a desperate gamble, and it had failed. The Allies, by contrast, had proven not only their resilience but their mastery of modern war. They had shown that battles were not won by daring plans alone, but by the steady hum of engines, the endless convoys of trucks, the pipelines running beneath oceans, and the mountains of fuel that powered it all. In the snowy silence of early 1945, as American units pushed the Germans back toward their own borders, the message was unmistakable. The age of strategy without logistics was over. Fuel was the blood of armies, and America had more of it than any other nation in the world. That fact, more than any single weapon or commander, had determined the fate of the Battle of the Bulge. As the Ardennes campaign drew to a close, the snow-covered battlefields told the story more vividly than any after-action report could. Abandoned German vehicles dotted the roadsides, silent reminders of a war machine that had run out of breath. Sherman tanks, fueled and resupplied, rumbled past these wrecks on their way to push the front line eastward. American soldiers, weary but determined, marched forward with the certainty that their strength was backed by an industrial empire that would never allow them to run dry. For German survivors, the memory of the offensive became a haunting lesson. Veterans of Panzer units spoke of their humiliation at watching engines stall, of entire columns reduced to helplessness in the freezing cold. Some remembered seeing fuel depots in the distance, tantalizingly close, guarded by Americans who knew that protecting gasoline was more vital than holding ground. The image of 3.3 million gallons of fuel, just out of reach, burned into their memories more than any firefight. It was the cruelest irony of all, that victory lay not in tactical brilliance, but in the simple possession of fuel. American commanders, by contrast, spoke often of how close the battle had come to disaster. Yet they knew that their true advantage had always been deeper than troop numbers or firepower. It lay in the convoys, the pipelines, the tankers, and the oil fields that never stopped producing. Eisenhower later remarked that the proximity of such immense fuel stores to the front had been both a risk and a blessing. If the Germans had seized them, the course of battle might have shifted dramatically. Yet the Americans had held firm, and the gamble had paid off. The war did not end in the Ardennes, but the Battle of the Bulge marked the last German offensive in the West. From that point forward, the Wehrmacht was on the defensive, retreating ever closer to Berlin. Their armies, battered and undersupplied, could no longer mount grand operations. The panzers that had once embodied German might were now ghosts of their former selves, scattered and abandoned, their power extinguished not by Allied guns, but by empty fuel tanks. For the Allies, the lesson was absorbed into doctrine. Modern war was industrial war, and industrial war demanded logistics on a scale never before imagined. Operation PLUTO and the Red Ball Express had proven that supply was not just support, it was victory itself. The men who drove trucks across treacherous winter roads, who laid pipelines beneath the sea, and who guarded depots in the Ardennes were as essential to the outcome as the soldiers who fought in foxholes. Their contribution was measured not in medals or headlines, but in gallons delivered, and those gallons had broken the back of the German army. When historians later studied the Ardennes offensive, they often marveled at the courage of both sides, the desperate ferocity of the German assault, and the stubborn resistance of the Americans. Yet beneath the stories of bravery lay a deeper truth, that the outcome had been decided long before the first shots were fired. America's oil production, 180 million tons a year, had crushed Germany's meager 5.7 million before the armies even met. The battle was the inevitable collision of two nations, one fueled to abundance, the other starved into collapse. As the snow melted and spring approached in 1945, American soldiers pushed across the Rhine, their vehicles fueled and ready. German defenses faltered, unable to regroup, unable to refuel, unable to sustain the fight. The road to Berlin lay open, and the end was in sight. The Battle of the Bulge had not only been Germany's last offensive, it had been the moment when fuel itself proved to be the decisive weapon of the war. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge, the world could no longer deny what the Ardennes had revealed with brutal clarity. The war was no longer about surprise offensives, or daring maneuvers. It was about who could keep their machines moving, who could supply their armies with the lifeblood of modern conflict, fuel. The Germans had marched into the Ardennes with courage, with determination, and with some of the finest armored vehicles ever built. But they had not marched with enough fuel to sustain them. The Americans, by contrast, fought with equal bravery but carried with them a logistical system that seemed endless. Operation PLUTO's pipelines pumped 1,000,000 gallons a day across the English Channel. The Red Ball Express moved 12,500 tons daily on Europe's roads. Convoys crossed the Atlantic unceasingly, delivering petroleum, munitions, and supplies. This was the true arsenal of democracy, not just weapons, but the capacity to fuel them indefinitely. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Where German Panzers sputtered and died in the snow, American Shermans kept rolling forward. Where German infantry shivered in exhaustion, Allied divisions marched on full stomachs, backed by steady resupply. Where Hitler gambled on seizing Antwerp to split the Allies, Eisenhower and his commanders relied on mathematics and production, knowing that the numbers would always favor them. The Battle of the Bulge proved that modern war could no longer be won by ideology or sheer willpower. It would be decided by fuel gauges, supply depots, and the pipelines that connected continents. For the men who fought there, the lesson remained etched in memory. American soldiers recalled with pride the sight of abandoned German armor, once terrifying, now nothing more than frozen carcasses along the roadside. German veterans, captured or retreating, spoke of the hopelessness of advancing while knowing that their engines would fail them. The battle had been brutal, the losses heavy, but the truth was unmistakable. Germany had been defeated not just in combat, but in capacity. Historians later calculated that America's oil production alone dwarfed that of the entire Axis. In 1944, the United States produced 180 million tons of petroleum, while Germany, strangled by blockade and bombing, managed only 5.7 million. No campaign, no matter how daring, could alter that imbalance. It was a war of factories and refineries, and once America's might was fully mobilized, the outcome was already written. The Ardennes became the turning point not because it changed the course of the war, but because it showed the world beyond doubt that Germany could no longer dictate events. The last German offensive had ended in fuel starvation, and from that moment forward, the Reich was on the defensive, retreating toward an inevitable end. The Allies surged forward, tanks fueled, convoys endless, supply chains unbroken. The march to Berlin was not just a triumph of arms, but of oil, steel, and logistics. In the quiet after the snow melted and the fields of Belgium and Luxembourg were cleared, the truth stood clear. Courage had been shown on both sides. Sacrifices had been immense. But victory belonged to the side that could keep its engines running. The Americans had 3.3 million gallons of gasoline waiting in depots while German tanks ran dry within sight of them. That simple fact told the story of the battle, and perhaps of the war itself. When Eisenhower reflected on the conflict, he called fuel the most vital single commodity in war. The Battle of the Bulge proved him right. The age of armies surviving on grit alone was over. The future of warfare was industrial, logistical, and mathematical. And in that future, America's power was unchallenged. Thus, the Battle of the Bulge entered history not only as Germany's last gamble, but as the moment the world realized the true weapon of victory was not the tank, not the gun, not even the soldier. It was the gallon of fuel that kept them moving.